Welcome to another episode of Murder Talk Radio. I am Parker Evans,
And I'm Victoria Evans.
and today we are talking about the psychopathology of the criminal mind.
Psychopathology is the branch of psychiatric science that studies mental illness. The field as a whole includes the study of cognition and abnormal mental states, all pathologies or mental disorders, as well as maladaptive behaviors and experiences that diverge wildly from the spectrum of existing social norms.
Criminal psychology is related to forensic psychology, but typically focuses more directly on criminal behaviors and the relationship between psychiatric disorders and criminal behavior. Criminal psychology also focuses on profiling criminal offenders. Forensic psychology focuses more on the intersection of psychology and law, and forensic psychologists often work as jury consultants and evaluate the competency of the accused to help determine whether a defendant should be held criminally liable for their actions or whether they're fit to stand trial at all.
The Murder Pop article that all of this is based on is broken up into two sections. The first section is about the psychopathology of the criminal mind, which is an overview of the primary psychopathological components of criminality and general violence.
We start with a look at some false claims from major organizations that mental illness has little or no relationship with criminality, which is not true.
No.
Then the second section, we look at the psychopathology of serial killers. And that's a detailed look at the primary motivations, personality components, and psychopathologies of serial murderers and mass murderers as a group.
So when it comes to the psychopathology of the criminal mind, many people have falsely claimed that it is a myth that people with mental illness are more likely to commit crimes than people without mental illness. And the Association of Healthcare Journalists claims in an article written by Caddy Gray that several studies have shown that the opposite is true.
I guess they mean that people without mental illness are more likely to commit crimes than people with mental illness, which studies have absolutely not shown that to be true, which we'll get into here. Gray also claims in that article that most crimes are committed by people who have no mental illness diagnosis, and that people with mental illness are more likely to be crime victims than perpetrators. That's actually true. It's one of the few true things in that article. She also claims that people with schizophrenia and related psychotic disorders are, quote, the likeliest of all people with mental illness to commit crimes. I couldn't believe it when I read that because it's absolutely false. But most of her claims are false, and reality is much more complicated than she presents it to be.
Absolutely.
It is true that most people with mental illness, especially if you're just looking, mental illness is such a wide group of disorders. Somebody who has depression has a mental illness. Autism is a mental illness. There are all kinds of mental illnesses, and most of them don't raise the risk of criminal offense. But a lot of them do. And it's crazy to me that somebody could claim otherwise.
When it comes to psychosis, during an initial psychotic event, the homicide rate is nearly 15 times greater than after treatment, and it's significantly higher compared to subsequent psychotic episodes, even in the absence or discontinuation of treatment as well.
If you click the link that's in the description, you will be able to see whether you're a paid subscriber or not. You'll be able to see a chart courtesy of the excellent data account Cremu, and it shows that in a graphical form. And you can see that first episode of Psychosis, the homicide rate is 159 per 100,000, and previously treated psychosis, it's 11 per 100,000.
Massive difference.
Huge difference. A systematic review and meta-analysis that was published in a journal called Schizophrenia Bulletin just this year, earlier in 2024, found that, quote, rates of any type of violence in between 35 and 39% during an initial psychotic episode. And the same study found a pooled prevalence of 13.4% for any violence, 16.3% for less serious violence, 9.7% for serious violence, and 2.7% for severe violence. And that was with an 11.6% rate before the presentation of psychosis in someone who eventually developed schizophrenia, 20.8% at the first psychotic episode within schizophrenia, and dropped back down to 13.3% after presentation to treatment.
According to research published by the American According to research published by the American Psychological Association in 2014, quote, of crimes committed by participants with bipolar disorder, 62% were directly or mostly related to symptoms, compared with 23% for schizophrenia and 15% for depression.
You know, I believe their research that they published, but they titled that article, Mental Illness Not Usually Linked to Crime, Research Finds.
Yeah, that was weird.
Very misleading headline.
Like, there's
62% are directly or mostly related to symptoms of bipolar disorder, but mental illness is not usually linked to crime. And the other ones are lower, but they're still linked to crime.
They are. I think that it's misleading because, their claim is based on the subjective determination of like whether or not the crimes were directly related to actual symptoms of whatever mental illness they're discussing. And I think that that's why it's clearly just so misleading, because the data might be accurate, but like they're clearly mentally ill either way.
You know, I won't get into it, but there's a second link there in the paid section of the article that this is based on. And the APA, the American Psychological Association, they seem to be in the habit of publishing misleading, false, or contradictory material.
Yeah.
Even beyond being misleading, most of the claims that they make in that article are false. An article that was published in the journal Behavioral Sciences and the Law states that, quote, the general theory of crime, which, by the way, this isn't part of the quote, but is very well accepted, and there's a fairly large body of evidence substantiating it, and that body of evidence continues to grow. But the quote is explained by the combination of situational opportunity and lack of self-control. Impulsivity is one of the important components of self-control. And that's according to the journal Behavioral Sciences and the Law, which I guess has better writers than the American Psychological Association, even though presumably they are members of the APA.
Other research suggests that, quote, most incarcerated offenders, 50% to 80%, have behavioral histories that meet diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder, whereas a smaller subgroup, 15% to 30%, meets criteria for psychopathy.
The U.S. Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Statistics had some interesting statistics on this. They said that 49.9% of prisoners have, quote, no indication of a mental health problem. And if 49.9% of prisoners have no indication of a mental health problem, that means 50.1% of prisoners do have an indication of a mental health problem, thus, again, linking criminals with mental illness.
Right.
Some more of those stats. The Department of Justice says that only 8.7% of prisoners have schizophrenia, whereas 17.5% have bipolar disorder, 13% have a cluster B personality disorder, and I found this particularly interesting. They also said that more females, 66%, as compared to males, 35%, had a history of mental health problems in the criminal justice system.
I thought that was really interesting as well.
They also said that married inmates were the least likely to have ever been told that they had a mental disorder at 40% when compared to inmates with other marital statuses. Almost 60% of inmates who were widowed, 51% who were divorced, 50% who were separated, and 43% who were never married had been told that they had a mental disorder compared to 40% of married inmates. And I found this one weird. If you have a college degree and you're in prison, apparently you're more likely to have a mental health problem.
I think that's interesting as well.
Yeah.
Sure. We don't get into this in the article, but it really makes me wonder if that has to do with the college experience or the experience of, just the pressure, the external pressure of getting a college degree, or something that has to do with socioeconomic class. It's so weird.
It's interesting that you mentioned class, because my first thought was that people who were able to attain a college degree likely have better access to mental health care treatment. And so by virtue of that alone, they're going to be more likely to have had a diagnosis. You can't get a diagnosis unless you see someone for a diagnosis.
Right.
Through impulsivity and emotional lability, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is linked to violence, according to an article published in the Journal of Child and Adolescent Psychopharmacology, which says that, quote, emotional impulsivity and dysregulation appear to be a central feature of ADHD. Emotional impulsivity refers to deficits in the first step of emotional self-control, that is, the ability to inhibit strong emotional reactions to environmental events. Like criminal opportunities.
The article also says that some studies suggest that early onset, quote, early onset, pervasive, and unremitting impulsive aggression in the context of impulsive thoughts, emotional ability, and impulsive behavior represents a high-risk profile for progression from childhood ADHD to adult antisocial disorders.
A study by Stockholm University found that people who were sentenced for criminal offenses had a higher prevalence of ADHD than the general population. And they said that, quote, neglect was the only adverse social factor associated with a higher crime rate and affected boys more than girls. Another study found that people with ADHD are far more likely to be arrested, convicted, and imprisoned. And a third study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine found that criminality in those diagnosed with ADHD can be attenuated with treatment and medication. So if you have untreated ADHD, you're somewhere around 30 times more likely to end up in prison than if you have treated ADHD.
As someone with ADHD, I find this fascinating. We talked about it earlier today, actually, just the two of us. We were talking about how ADHD is conceptualized as it's the hyper problem child, who can't focus, but it's so much more complex than that. And there are so many components and different kinds of ADHD. I can absolutely see all of this coming together.
There was a systematic review published in 2014 that found that, quote, extreme forms of violence may be a result of a highly complex interaction of biological, psychological, and sociological factors, and that potentially a significant proportion of mass killers or serial killers have neurodevelopmental disorders such as autism spectrum disorder or head injury. I didn't include it in the article, but there's a connection that they found between TBI or traumatic brain injury and criminality, which I thought was interesting.
There are so many killers who have had traumatic brain injuries.
That really doesn't surprise me.
It doesn't. I do think it's very interesting because of the nature of the brain. It's, someone could get hit in the head with a baseball bat and be totally fine. And then someone could get hit in the head with a baseball bat and be, Gary Heidnik stringing up sheep. You know what I mean? As a kid, like on a farm.
Wasn't there an NFL player who had been found to have had a bunch of concussions who he killed his family or something? Is that ringing any bells? I think that was a thing. I think I remember that happening. I just don't remember who the player was. But he was a football player.
I want to say yes, but I don't know who.
There was a wrestler who did that too.
Did OJ have any?
I mean, yeah.
Any head injuries?
Every football player gets some
I'm curious. That's absolutely true. It's just like the concussion element there is high. I just mean in childhood.
I don't know about childhood.
Like as the brain is developing. I mean, a lot of athletes start really young too. So.
That's true, but the study didn't differentiate there. It was just traumatic brain injury, period.
Yeah.
There was another study. I'm sorry, go ahead.
This is somewhat, I just wanted to mention this because there's this woman named Kanika Batra who has a platform about, telling people that she has been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. She thinks she's not a narcissist, but I don't know, I think she is. And she made a little video on TikTok about how people with autism cannot have ASPD, like it can't be comorbid. And I made a comment saying that they absolutely can be comorbid, and I thought that her research was garbage. And her boyfriend jumped on that comment like immediately and came back at me with some condescension.
Interesting that he came back at you with condescension and not some kind of scientific study of some kind that validated the claim.
Right. Yeah. This happened a long time ago, and I thought, wow, that's par for the course.
I agree that at the very least, even if it's true that somebody has a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, they would have to have, at the very least, they would have to have high trait narcissism to make a video where they said that they did. And,
absolutely.
And my suspicion would be that they think that there's some kind of social gravitas to claiming that they have ASPD, whereas there isn't really a social gravitas to claiming that you have narcissism, because it implies that you're just super self-involved. And I don't know, it just seems super self-involved to make a video like that.
It is. Her whole channel is like, hi, I'm Kanika Batra, and I'm a diagnosed sociopath, and this is how you control men. Like, that's the same. I'm serious. Like, that is, like, her whole format. I'm a diagnosed sociopath. Hi, I'm a diagnosed sociopath. Like, she went on TV about it. Like, or one, like, TV series or something. I don't know. I was fascinated by the fact that she would come out and so many people commented, you're a narcissist. And she said, this is why I don't think I'm a narcissist. You know what I mean?
Sounds like she's got her boyfriend under control. He jumped your comment.
She made some weird comments about how she thought that he had higher traits of ASPD than she did, which I thought was a weird I would say a weird way to word that, but actually, to be honest, I haven't looked into her in a minute, so I don't know what the exact wording is. Anyway, sorry for that aside. I just thought that was fascinating.
A 2010 study on bipolar disorder found that more people with bipolar disorder, 8.4%, committed violent crime compared to the control in the general population, which was 3.5%. So that means if you have bipolar disorder, you're more than twice as likely to commit a violent crime than someone without bipolar disorder. And another interesting thing they found there was that the risk was mostly confined to patients who had a substance abuse comorbidity, and that they said the risk was minimal in patients without substance abuse comorbidity. They also found no difference in violent crime by clinical subgroups, meaning like manic versus depressive or psychotic versus non-psychotic bipolar.
There's a similar study conducted in 2011 that found that, quote, compared to other subjects, those with convictions had more ASPD symptoms, less education, more substance use disorder, more suicide attempt history, and a more recurrent course with propensity towards mania.
ASPD is antisocial personality disorder. Just in case anybody doesn't know the acronym. As it relates to violent aggression specifically, the single biggest predictor of violence, it's funny because we were just talking about narcissism and that guy jumping your comment, but trait narcissism, high levels of trait narcissism is the biggest single predictor of violence. The link between narcissism and aggression of all forms has been repeatedly substantiated in studies, and that's regardless of any kind of controlling for confounds like gender, age, education, nationality, all kinds of it. Just if you have high trait narcissism, you are way, way, way more likely to commit an impulsive, violent act.
Studies show that even when narcissism was within what is considered a normal range, higher levels of narcissism remain linked to higher levels of aggression. So just as you were saying, I thought that was super interesting that the narcissism seems to be kind of what all of the personality disorders kind of revolve around.
Yeah, there was a meta-study that was led by a graduate student at Ohio State whose name I'm not going to try to pronounce because I will butcher it. It's some kind of strange Nordic name. Her name is Sophie Kjaervik. And it's that, what's that?
Kjaervik.
Yeah.
What?
I just couldn't remember the name of that symbol where the A and the E are combined into one letter.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, that's part of her name, but I can't remember what it's called.
Since I'm trying to remember it, it's gone.
Of course. That's always the way it works. But she published that meta-study in the journal Psychological Bulletin. And that study had a total of over 100,000 participants. And she said, quote, "The link we found between narcissism and aggression was significant. It was not trivial in size." Narcissism comes in a bunch of different varieties or flavors. There's grandiose narcissism, communal narcissism, which is a form of grandiose narcissism, like a subform. There's vulnerable or covert narcissism and malignant narcissism. And those subtypes all overlap with each other and also with other personality disorders. All of the cluster Bs exist on a sort of a spectrum. But her study found that all forms of narcissism were linked to aggressive behaviors.
Communal narcissism? Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I just, very, very interesting. The communal narcissism is, I like to call it cult narcissism, but that's just me.
It's not a bad name for it.
It's a form of grandiose narcissism. in which extroverted narcissists who have an inflated view of their personal characteristics believe themselves to be morally superior in a communal domain.
Yeah,
So they have a platform.
They present themselves as like altruists.
Yeah.
Like they deeply care, and they're very civic oriented. And there's a bunch of links to this in the article for our paid subscribers. But basically, there's a huge amount of emerging evidence that communal narcissists can be found in a variety of causes related to political activism and social justice, including feminist activism, rape activism, just any kind of like feminist activism, any kind of social justice oriented activism attracts these power-seeking, self-serving narcissists.
The rape activism aspect is interesting to me because there's a component of violence to it, and I feel like that would just attract like the connection there that's made between aggression and narcissism. It makes me think of all the different women like Amber Heard, who is connected to Me Too and using that platform to kind of talk about blah, blah, blah. And then it comes out, that she is anything but, a perfect victim. Anyways.
Getting into the history of all this a little, narcissism has been linked with psychopathy. And it was noted in the journal. It wasn't a journal, actually. It's a series of scientific books, I believe. Current Topics in Behavioral Neurosciences said that psychopaths can be alarmingly violent. And the very first links between psychopathy and violence were established by Dr. Hervey M. Cleckley in what's considered a seminal book in the field titled The Mask of Sanity, an attempt to clarify some issues about the so-called psychopathic personality. And that was first published in 1941.
I love the subtitle. I don't know why it makes me laugh. It's like, trying to figure out what the hell's going on.
I don't think I mentioned this in the article, but the reason that he titled it "The Mask of Sanity," that mask idea is a concept that we still use today. That narcissists and psychopaths wear a mask when they're out, a psychological mask. It's how serial killers are able to convince people that they're normal, and what leads their neighbors to go on TV after they get caught, and their neighbors say, like, I never would have known that he was eating dead bodies in that garage. Ew. He used to deliver me flowers on Mother's Day. That's not a quote from anybody.
I know, that's why. Otherwise, I might still laugh, but it would be kind of a different.
But so Cleckley was the first person to establish a link between psychopathy, predatory sexual sadism, the most serious sex crimes, and he was also the first person to suggest that there were links between elements of juvenile delinquency and psychopathy. And to this day, a diagnosis of conduct disorder in childhood is required to establish a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder in adulthood. And conduct disorder is sometimes called youth psychopathy.
The book describes clinical interviews conducted with patients who have been institutionalized. In 1988, the copyright for The Mask of Sanity was released for nonprofit educational use. And so if you click the link in the description, we have the PDF included for you if you're interested in reading it.
For our paid subs, although if
Right.
you're not a paid sub, you could also just search for it on the web and you'll find it because it's all over the place. The clinical profile that Cleckley came up with to describe behavioral characteristics of psychopaths consists of the following traits: superficial charm with good intelligence, absence of delusions or other signs of irrational thinking, absence of nervousness or psychoneurotic manifestations, unreliability, untruthfulness, insincerity, lack of remorse, lack of shame, inadequately motivated antisocial behavior, poor judgment, failure to learn by experience, pathologic egocentricity, incapacity for love, general poverty in major affective reactions, meaning they had blunted affect, specific loss of insight, meaning they don't have insight into their own behaviors, unresponsiveness in general interpersonal relations, fantastic and uninviting behavior with drink and sometimes without. That one made me laugh because he may have just well said that they have fantastic and uninviting behavior, but sometimes with drink and sometimes not. Suicide threats that they rarely actually carry out, they just use them to manipulate the empathy of others. Sex life impersonal, trivial, and poorly integrated, and also a failure to follow any life plan.
Cleckley's clinical profile that Parker just read for you is extremely similar to other classification systems for psychopaths and for malignant narcissists that were developed later on. Malignant narcissism combines trait elements of all cluster B personality disorders. This includes, but is not limited to, narcissistic, paranoid, antisocial, and sadistic personality disorder.
Social psychologist Erich Fromm coined the term malignant narcissism in 1964. He described what he called a severe mental illness and the quintessence of evil. He said it was the most severe pathology and the root of the most vicious destructiveness and inhumanity. And then in the 1980s, another psychoanalyst named Otto Kernberg suggested that malignant narcissism exists on a spectrum of pathological narcissism, and that criminal psychopathy is the most extreme form of pathological narcissism. According to Kernberg, a psychopath has a paranoid view of external influences and is unwilling to internalize the values of those who they perceive as aggressors, where malignant narcissists maintain their capacity to admire powerful people because they can depend on the reliable parental images of their sadistic and powerful parents.
Malignant narcissists may also internalize, quote, some identification with other powerful idealized figures, which permits at least some capacity for loyalty to their own comrades. And this leads to, quote, the idealization of the aggressive, sadistic features of the pathological grandiose self of these patients. I think that really, at its core, is part of why it's so toxic, because of how upheld some of the negative traits are.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. People who have narcissistic personality disorder, malignant narcissism, and psychopathy all exhibit similar symptoms as detailed in the Hare Psychopathy Checklist, which is a psychological assessment tool often used in criminal justice, which was developed in the 70s and I believe first published in 1980 by Dr. Robert Hare. And that's based partially on Hare's work with inmates, and it's based partially on Cleckley's clinical profile from The Mask of Sanity, which we read a moment ago, and we'll get into Hare's own items on his checklist, which are very similar to what you just heard from The Mask of Sanity. But we have some quotes here from Dr. Hare, who was a forensic psychologist, and he says that, quote, psychopaths are social predators, and like all predators, they are looking for feeding grounds. Wherever you get power, prestige, and money, you will find them. And I thought that was pretty interesting in reference to the communal narcissism, because it's less about per se victimizing people in a direct way, And it's more victimizing people in an indirect way through using power, prestige, and money as leverage.
Right.
And there's a second quote where he says, psychopaths have a grandiose self-structure which demands a scornful and detached devaluation of others in order to ward off their envy towards the good perceived in other people.
The Hare Psychopathy Checklist is also known as the PCLR. The R is for revised. And this list consists of 20 items that are scored based on the degree to which they appear in the test subject.
You can get a score of, depending on the trait, it's 0 to 2. So it's a 3-point score. Either you don't have it, you have it a little, or you have it a lot.
The scores can be used to predict the risk of recidivism, and research shows that there is a high risk of recidivism and a small chance of rehabilitation for those with a high score in psychopathy. The following is a list comprised of the items in the current version of the PCLR.
Before you read that list, I just want to suggest that people bear in mind the list that they just heard me read from The Mask of Sanity, because they are very, very similar.
They really are. And I think it's interesting how this one is, it's worded slightly differently. And like if you put them side by side, it's interesting to see like the slight variations, but there is a massive consistency here in these traits.
Despite 40 years of research in between them.
Right. Like that, I mean, that speaks volumes. So the first one on the list, glibness, superficial charm. A grandiose sense of self-worth, need for stimulation, proneness to boredom, pathological lying, conning and manipulative behavior, lack of remorse or guilt, shallow affect, callous, lack of empathy, parasitic lifestyle, poor behavioral controls, promiscuous sexual behavior, early behavior problems, lack of realistic long-term goals, impulsivity, irresponsibility, failure to accept responsibility for their own actions, many short-term marital relationships, juvenile delinquency, revocation of conditional release, and criminal versatility.
Just to throw this has nothing to do with the article, but we're in the process of putting all our stuff into storage and moving out of our apartment to move into Doris, the van. And we're just both kind of exhausted. We've been working all day, and we just came home and we're trying to get some podcasts done because we're not sure how we're not sure of the process for recording in the van yet. We haven't figured that out yet. So we're just trying to get a couple of these knocked out before we're living in a place with no power and with our media production tower and recording desk in storage. So that's, if we sound tired, that's why.
It's because we are.
It's because we are, that's right.
Still, this is fascinating, and I do love to talk about it and share it with all of you. Hopefully we'll be able to record in the van in some way.
I mean, we'll figure it out. We got to get a battery system, and the desk that we have for recording is great because you can record without a computer, which will be nice because we'll be unlimited power. So I'll be able to record our podcasts and then, but not with this one because it's too big. It's got 16 inputs and it's huge. And I don't want to bring it into a van with us, but Tascam makes this desk, and they make a smaller one that has less inputs. So I'm going to try to pick one of those up in the next couple weeks, and we'll use that. Pull a couple of these mics out of storage and go from there.
Yep.
Anyway, the current edition of the psychopathy checklist uses the items that you just heard to measure what it calls personality factors. Factor 1 measures selfishness, callousness and lack of remorse. And factor 2 measures the unstable, antisocial, and social deviance of the testee. And these factors all correlate with the cluster B personality disorders and are associated with extroversion, reactive anger, criminality, impulsive violence, and emotional affect, which is the emotional expression that's found in an individual's features and body language.
A healthy person has full affect, meaning emotional reactions that are typical or expected. Psychopaths may have shallow or blunted affect, characterized by emotional detachment and shallow emotional expressions. They may also have flat affect. This is characterized by little outward expression of emotionality, including facial expressions, body language, gesticulations, and vocal tone.
It's important not to assume that someone is a psychopath based just on shallow affect or flat affect, because both blunted and flat affect are sometimes a symptom of other psychiatric illnesses like post-traumatic stress disorder, autism, schizophrenia, even Parkinson's disease and traumatic brain injuries can cause flat or blunted affect.
What differentiates the affect of psychopaths is that they appear indifferent towards the feelings of others and remorseless with respect to their harmful actions against others. So, pay attention for that.
High scores on the Hare psychopathy checklist are associated with impulsivity, aggression, persistent criminal behavior, and a lack of empathy. And although it's commonly believed that psychopaths, quote, may not experience emotions to the same degree as others, which impairs their ability to empathize at all, there's a really fascinating study published in the journal Brain in 2013, which suggested that rather than lacking empathy, psychopaths can switch their empathy on and off, allowing them to access it when they need to, but ignore it the rest of the time when it's convenient to them to do so.
The senior author of the study, Christian Kiezers, from the Netherlands, told the BBC that, quote, they don't lack empathy, but they have a switch to turn it on and off. By default, it seems to be off.
One of the things that's interesting about that is that empathy is necessary for a lot of psychopaths to do the criminal things that they do. I kind of made reference to this earlier when I imitated a serial killer's neighbor that you would see on TV, because you can't trick somebody into thinking that you're normal and that you just want to give them a ride to the grocery store when actually you want to murder them, unless you have empathy, because you have to be able to get inside of their head and figure out what's going to make them feel comfortable, because you have some kind of plan where you're about to murder them, but you need to get them into your car.
It could be a cold and calculated way to just mimic the empathetic behaviors of others, but I think that psychopaths have to have, as you said, some kind of like ability to see what a like certain individual who they are trying to manipulate, like what do they need to do to make that individual trust them. So I think that is really interesting. I've often wondered, just in all my time consuming true crime and reading different case files, that like it kind of appears to be a myth that they don't have any kind of empathy at all.
Well, if you think about, and there's a self-serving element to this as well, but if you think about the work that you did on Israel Keyes, if you take his request to the FBI not to divulge the case, not to talk about the case, not to publicize the case, at face value based on his request is made out of empathy for his daughter and his ex-girlfriend,
Yep.
who he didn't want to burden with his crimes.
Yep.
I think there's a self-serving element to that as well, because it allowed him to maintain the facade that he had created with people who knew him. So there's a narcissistic element there that's self-serving. But there's still an implication that he has access to an internal empathy system.
Maybe they have so much empathy that it doesn't actually... Never mind. Never mind.
I think they can just basically, I think they can just ignore it. There's a...
Right, like it doesn't impact them because they have a...
Well, because there's a switch.
They're shallow.
In most people, it's automatic. You know, if you do something that hurts somebody else, you feel bad about it afterwards. They don't have... It's not automatic for them. There has to be an element to where they choose to feel bad about it. So like for Keyes, where it affects his daughter, it makes him feel bad about it. Doesn't feel bad about what he did to his victims.
No.
Just about how it affects his daughter.
Who is an extension of himself.
Yeah.
I personally think Keyes was a lot more BPD than anyone kind of assumes to him. But that is for another Murder Talk Radio.
He may have been... I see a lot of narcissism in Keyes myself.
I see a lot of narcissism and a lot of BPD with the substance abuse and the crying outbursts and stuff like that.
Well, you know, narcissists have impulsivity problems too.
Absolutely.
There's a high degree of substance abuse in narcissists as well. Not to say he didn't have BPD. There's a spectrum, so...
Right.
He likely had elements of lots of different personality disorders.
Well, he definitely had youth psychopathy. He definitely was a juvenile delinquent.
Well, malignant narcissism and psychopathy actually overlap in a personality construct called the dark triad, which was proposed by Delroy Paulus and Kevin Williams in a paper that they published in the Journal of Research and Personality, the Journal of Research in Personality, back in 2002. And that paper describes overlapping non-pathological personality types with subclinical levels of trait Machiavellianism, narcissistic personality disorder, and psychopathy. And the construct is not exclusively negative traits. Bravery and assertiveness are also considered components of this personality type. And it's also associated with people in leadership positions, so like CEOs and stuff like that often have this dark triad personality type. Another paper that was published in the Journal of Individual Differences in 2015 expanded on this to propose an additional component of sadism to form what they called the dark tetrad. And that paper found that dark tetrad traits can be located in the space of basic personality traits, especially in regards to honesty, humility, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and emotionality as personality dimensions. And the paper concludes that, quote, sadism behaves in a similar manner as the other dark traits, but cannot be reduced to them. And I didn't include this in the article, but I believe they also found that a lot of the negative traits, negative behaviors that were associated with the dark triad are explained by the additional component of sadism. So if you take out the sadism component and you look just at the dark triad traits, you see more of like the CEO types.
Right.
And if you add the sadism in as a controlling factor, then you see more like the serial killer, serial rapist types.
big distinction there.
There's a social psychologist named Keith Campbell, who's a professor of psychology in the University of Georgia's Franklin College of Arts and Sciences, who published the Handbook of Narcissism and Narcissistic Personality Disorder. And he defined malignant narcissism as a combination of narcissism and sadism. And as a side note, we're hoping, we haven't heard back from him yet, but we're hoping that we will get to interview Dr. Keith Campbell at some point in the near future.
That'd be phenomenal. I would love to talk to him. He's fascinating. Malignant narcissism is considered to be a very important component in the conceptual framework of the study of mass murder, serial killing, and predatory sexual sadism. Malignant narcissism includes foundational characteristics common to all narcissists, such as an inflated sense of personal superiority and associated arrogance, exaggerated talents and accomplishments, an excessive need for admiration, a high degree of jealousy, envy, and entitlement, expectations of special treatment, exploitative and manipulative, taking advantage of others, a lack of both personal accountability and regard for others, unstable and shallow relationships, impulsivity and a lack of self-control, high reactivity to perceived criticism, paranoid ideations and delusions of persecution.
And malignant narcissism adds components like egocentric aggression. And for people around, I know that's kind of a big old SAT word. Egocentric means consistent with the ideal self-image. So that means that a malignant narcissism, as being aggressive, is ideal for them as a personality trait.
I thought it sounded like something you'd order at a bar.
An egocentric?
Yes.
Yeah, could I get, you know what, I think I'll have an egocentric.
On the rocks.
Also a need for power, control, and domination, and sadism. And in addition to psychopathy, narcissism, antisocial personality, etc., there's also evidence that another cluster B personality disorder also has links to criminality, and that's obsessive compulsive personality disorder. That's different. It's distinct from obsessive compulsive disorder, which the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual places in the separate category of obsessive compulsive and related disorders, not personality disorders.
I have never seen a serial killer portrayed in TV or film who had this kind of obsessive compulsive personality disorder, except in The House That Jack Built. Though Lars von Trier kind of, for those of you who have seen it, you'll know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, warning. But it shows this serial killer who's obsessed with cleaning. So I think it really takes the OCD element there. And I just thought that was an interesting overlap.
Well, I actually kind of disagree with what you said. I think that most media portrayals of serial killers involve elements of obsessive compulsive personality disorder, not necessarily obsessive compulsive disorder.
Right, I'm sorry.
Obsessive
that was
compulsive
confusing.
personality disorder, because there was an article published in the journal Psychiatry, Psychology, and Law in 2020 that details categories of obsessions and compulsions that are linked to obsessive compulsive personality disorder specifically. And check out this list and tell me if you think that these fit with the media portrayals of serial killers. Aggressive obsessions, sexual obsessions, religious obsessions, superstitious and magical obsessions, perfectionistic obsessions, obsessions of harm, danger, loss, or embarrassment. Somatic obsessions, meaning intrusive thoughts about body processes and functions. Neutral obsessions and symmetry ordering obsessions, and feeling things need to be just right.
Absolutely.
I think that most media portrayals of serial killers involve some of those elements.
Absolutely. Jack has a high degree of neuroticism, and I think Lars von Trier specifically made him out to, like, he specifically mentions OCD, which is distinguished from what we're talking about. But I thought it was an interesting way to just show that outright. He's like obsessively cleaning up his own crimes.
The compulsions for OCPD include frequent washing and cleaning, and also checking things more than is necessary. And I thought that was interesting because
that's Jack.
Criminals often go back to the scene of the crime.
Yep.
Which is obsessive checking. That's what that is.
I think that it's difficult that because so much of this is, it's all like on a spectrum and there's a lot of overlapping. Sometimes I get confused with like distinguishing between what is considered what.
Well, just real quick, another compulsion that's associated with OCPD is a deep need to ask, tell, or confess. And a lot of serial killers do that.
So weird.
All the like letter writing and stuff, the games that they play with investigators, that's all a deep need to tell and confess.
It was me. I know exactly what happened. You guys were all wondering, but I have the answers. Well, I have all of the answers.
Even like a killer who sends a letter like, "You'll never find me," that's still telling.
Absolutely.
And you're providing clues for people to find you. So
it's a game that you're turning it into, that you get to be you control the game.
An obsessive compulsive game.
Right. Keyes had a similar thing. We talk so much about Keyes.
So we'll get into some different crimes. That article mentions a case discussed by Freud in his Notes upon a Case of Obsessional Neuroses, which he published in 1909, which was based on a patient named Ernst Lanzer.
The Rat Man.
I know you love the rats.
I do. I love rats. Not Ernst, though. Ernst Lanzer presented with a number of distressing obsessions. Principally, a fear of corporal punishment from his father and a female friend using rats. Ernst would then stare at his penis, sometimes in a mirror. His fear had grown out of an account that he had heard from a fellow army officer concerning a Chinese torture method in which a large pot containing live rats was strapped to the buttocks of the victim, and the rat was encouraged by a red-hot poker to gnaw its way through the victim's anus. So Ernst Lanzer claimed that he fantasized about murder and suicide and developed a number of compulsive, irrational behavior patterns.
There was a Japanese killer named Tsutomu Miyazaki, who you made a video of, who called himself the Rat Man.
Yep.
And there's a video about this. You guys can go listen to Victoria talk about Miyazaki on the Victoria Evans YouTube channel. It's a video titled "The Weird Rat Man Serial Killer Tsutomu Miyazaki," and there's a link conveniently located in the article for our paid subs.
You'll see some of his creepy drawings on the thumbnail. He would like draw rats while in court. Anyways.
The article that we were just discussing also details some other specific criminal cases, including R.V. Quinn, number 2, in New South Wales, Australia, which involved the stabbing murder of a girlfriend by an offender with OCD and borderline personality disorder who believed that his girlfriend was cheating on him. A forensic psychiatrist by the name of Dr. Olav Nielsen described, quote, his severe mood swings producing states of severe depression and also anger, and also the impairment in impulse control that goes with obsessive compulsive disorder. There's extreme sudden mood swings with irrational anger and severe depression that can be triggered by small events and appear completely disproportionate. And so it is a loss of emotional control. And the article also mentions a case in nearby New Zealand wherein a woman with OCD was found guilty of arson after she started a fire outside of the bedroom of her son. Quote, he considered that she had set up unnecessary concerns in the minds of the children that their father meant to cause them harm, and she was disconnected from reality. He described her as having fashioned an evil plan to deprive her husband of an entitlement, that is, the son. She was trying to kill her son. I know.
I'm sorry.
So now we're going to talk about the psychopathology of the serial killer. Most serial killers get a diagnosis of some kind, making it even more insane that multiple professional organizations claim that there is no link between mental illness and criminal behavior. Richard Chase was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. David Berkowitz was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Ted Kaczynski was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Ed Gein was diagnosed with regular schizophrenia. Jeffrey Dahmer was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, and a psychotic disorder. Ted Bundy was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Israel Keyes was diagnosed with quote-unquote antisocial tendencies. Dennis Rader was diagnosed with narcissistic, obsessive-compulsive, and antisocial personality disorders, and has been called a case study in psychopathy. Donald Henry Pee Wee Gaskins was diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. Carl Eugene Watts was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. Kristen Gilbert was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Eileen Wuornos was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. Sounds like there's a link between mental disorders and crime to me.
Absolutely.
Just based on that list alone.
In 2005, the FBI hosted a symposium on serial murder and produced a monograph entitled Serial Murder, Multidisciplinary Perspectives for Investigators. So we have included this here as a PDF for you, and you may recall on the Victoria Evans, my YouTube channel, I did a series called Myths About Serial Killers, and I specifically use serial murder as my source for the video. So feel free to check that out.
I also want to add, just like the earlier PDF that we mentioned that's in this article, it's just for the convenience of our paid subscribers. These are available for free on the internet. This is the Symposium of Serial Murder monograph is available on the FBI website. So if you're not a paid subscriber and you still want to go read this, you can just search for Serial Murder Monograph FBI and you should be able to find it. I have faith in you.
The FBI vault is incredible.
So, according to the monograph, serial killers differ individually in many ways, including their motivations for killing and their behavior at the crime scene. But attendees identified certain traits that are common to all, or some, most, serial murderers, including sensation-seeking, lack of remorse or guilt, impulsivity, the need for control, and predatory behaviors. They said that psychopathy is a personality disorder manifested in people who use a mixture of charm, manipulation, intimidation, and occasionally violence to control others in order to satisfy their own selfish emotional needs. And all psychopaths don't become serial murderers, but serial murderers possess some or even many traits consistent with psychopathy. Psychopaths who commit serial murder don't value human life. They're extremely callous in their interactions with their victims, particularly evident in sexually motivated serial killers who repeatedly target, stalk, assault, and kill without a sense of remorse. But psychopathy alone does not explain the motivations of a serial killer. And the monograph also notes some interesting criminal behavioral traits that are common to psychopaths that are known to differentiate psychopaths from other criminal offenders. Psychopaths are not sensitive to altruistic interview themes such as sympathy for their victims or remorse or guilt over their crimes. They do possess certain personality traits that can be exploited: their inherent narcissism, selfishness, and vanity. And specific themes that were used successfully in interviews of psychopathic serial killers focused on praising their intelligence, their cleverness, and their skill in evading capture.
In a 1994 article published in the Omega, Journal of Death and Dying, authors Dana DeHart and...
I think that's Dana.
Dana, D-A-N-A. Dana?
Dana.
Dana DeHart and John Mahoney go into great detail about the motivations of serial killers, noting that, contrary to the popular belief that they are unique to modernity, which is a myth that is still perpetuated today, there are known historical examples of serial killers.
In the 15th century, there was a child killer named, he was a baron, Gilles de Rais. He was a companion of Joan of Arc, and he's believed to have murdered over 140 children, and is also believed to have offered parts of a child in a ritual attempt to evoke a demon named Baron. And he was executed for those crimes in October of 1440. So this is not unique to the modern world.
They note that serial killing is defined in part, quote, by the nature of the murderer's motive, often sexual in nature, which has an intrinsic locus and commonly involves gratification derived from the act of murder itself.
They exclude individuals who murder in a serial fashion, but whose primary goals are extrinsically derived, like killers who murder as a result of a jealous rage or for material gain.
Particular to the motivation of serial killers, they note that this, quote, the serial killer who wants revenge does not pursue revenge against an individual. The murderer generalizes his or her hatred to an entire category of individuals and retaliates by victimizing that group somewhat randomly. They also note that, quote, motivational inferences may be complicated by, quote, reliability and validity problems in assessing the killer's interrogation.
DeHart and Mahoney delineate between 4 types of serial killer by referencing the work of Holmes and DeBurger, originally published in the journal Federal Probation in 1985 and the American Journal of Criminal Justice in 1988. And these include visionary serial killers who are motivated by psychotic delusions or hallucinations, mission-oriented murderers who consciously seek to rid society of a perceived undesirable group of people, and they cite Jack the Ripper as an example of this. They describe the hedonistic serial murderer who kills for thrill, pleasure, or contentment, and the power control serial murderer who compensates for a lack of social or personal mastery by exerting control over victims. And Holmes and DeBurger also note in their 1988 abstract that, and this is a direct quote, serial killers have never been rehabilitated.
Not surprised. I think that's virtually impossible.
I would tend to agree.
In the 2018 textbook, Introduction to Forensic Psychology, Research and Application, by Kurt and Ann Bartol, the authors note that, quote, one trait that appears to separate serial killers from the norm is their exceptional interpersonal skill in their presentation of self. Their ability to charm and fool others often elevates them beyond suspicion and makes them difficult to apprehend.
That's what we were talking about earlier. You have to have some sense of empathy to do that. You just have to.
I mean, I think part of it might not even be something that they actively have to
Be aware
try. Yeah, they don't have to be aware of it or switch it on and off. I think that is just the part of being a human, a complicated person. Like, I whether you're killing or not, people are complicated, and I am tired.
They
I'm sorry.
They go on and quote Joseph Fisher, who writes, perhaps most unsettling for the community was the behavior of victims, some of whom were reported to have gone willingly with their killer, even though they may have known what lay ahead. This blind trust, and the killer's exploitation of that trust, seemed to have an eerie, supernatural quality.
Oh, that always gets me. It's really heartbreaking.
They also note an interesting difference in modus operandi between male and female serial killers. Female serial killers most often murder those with whom they share a relationship, like husbands, intimate relationships, and even just acquaintances, whereas male serial killers, quote, prefer victims offering easy access and transience. Often their disappearance is not reported to police. For example, victims are often prostitutes, runaways, young male drifters, and itinerant farm workers whose family and friends may not even realize immediately that they're missing, but that with experience, improving skill, and a need for a greater challenge, the serial killers, male serial killers, often move on to more difficult victims, such as university or college students, children, the elderly, or even just the solitary poor. Like there was a guy that you literally just made a video on a week or two ago who is believed to be preying on homeless people in the Pacific Northwest.
Yep. I thought this was interesting because, well, I feel that, I know I'm not in like a official capacity in this field, but I am a journalist, and so I'm constantly researching, and I just see, like, I learned so much. I was under the impression that, serial killers would go from animals to children because they were small humans who are easier to deal with, but they're actually not. I'm like, why didn't I think that? People are looking for children. They're constantly worried about their children. They're difficult victims to target.
I'm not a journalist, but I play one on YouTube. They also say that only very rarely do serial murderers break in and terrorize, torture, and kill middle-class strangers in their homes.
A few other interesting bits of information found within Introduction to Forensic Psychology are that serial killers typically begin their killings between the ages of 24 and 40, and that most are between the ages of 27 when they begin killing and 32 when they last kill, and that serial killers rarely kill where they work or live, doing so only in 14 doing so only in 14% of cases, while 52% have territory that they kill within, and 30% commit their crimes across a wide geographical area.
When I was writing this, I thought it was weird that does not add up to, that adds up to 96%. So there's 4% of serial killers that we're not sure what their geographical preferences are, I guess.
Maybe they travel internationally.
Maybe, I don't know.
But I guess that would still fall into 30%, wouldn't it?
Yeah, the wide geographical area.
I don't know. I
I found it peculiar. 96%. Maybe they just don't know.
Maybe they're incarcerated.
Yeah, maybe they do it in prison.
A lot of them do.
The Bartols,
Actually, I don't know how accurate that is, but I do know that a lot do. I just don't know what the statistics on it are.
they also note that serial killers prefer a method of killing that provides the maximum amount of control and dominance over their victims. So, for instance, choking, stabbing, and any method of delayed death, any way that the killer can maintain mastery over a helpless victim to make them feel like they have power. And they also say that serial killers tend to be inspired by detailed and elaborate fantasies rich with themes of dominance. They describe a study which found 86% of serial killers had violent fantasies on a regular basis, and 58% of the same group had above average intelligence, although not much above average. It was like the high range of average.
Right, they're not geniuses.
No, that's actually a myth of
I am
serial killers.
like that myth kills me because it is so funny. Like they're just people.
So very quickly, 58% have above average intelligence, but if you look at killers of single victims, that number is 29%. So if you kill one person, you're more likely to have a below average intelligence.
Furthermore, many serial killers augment their fantasies with hardcore pornography, which often contains themes of violence, dominance, and bondage. In the past, police investigators often uncovered extensive libraries of films and tapes that portrayed acts of rape and murder.
Dr. James Dobson interviewed Ted Bundy the night before his execution on January 23rd, 1989. And in the interview, Bundy describes the impact he claims violent pornography and to a degree other violent media had on the development of his pathology, although we note with some suspicion that, as DeHart and Mahoney discussed in our earlier citation, quote, motivational inferences may be complicated by reliability and validity problems in assessing the killer's interrogation. If you watch the interview, and you can by clicking on the article, I edited down the interview to about just under 12 minutes of Bundy speaking. And if you watch his body language, his face, the faces he makes, his eyes, personally, and we had a conversation about this while I was editing the video down, he comes across as earnest if you just listen to his voice. But if you watch his face and eyes, he's putting on a play. He's trying to manipulate, it seems to me.
Absolutely.
There's I watched a body language expert on YouTube. I don't remember his name, but he's a psychologist professionally, and in particular is a body language expert. And he watched this interview, and he more or less agreed with my take. He did not find Bundy to be compellingly honest. So if it's true that Bundy was a power and control type of serial killer, he might just be spending his last night on Earth in an attempt to exert what little power and control is left to him.
There are several moments during this interview where his mask of sanity seems to slip. Cleckley, quote, questions whether this mask of sanity is voluntarily assumed to intentionally hide.
There was a 2020 meta-study published in the journal Trauma, Violence, and Abuse that says that, quote, scholars have not come to a consensus about whether effects are real in regards to violent pornography. And it concludes that although, quote, methodological weaknesses were very common in this field of research, evidence did not suggest that nonviolent pornography was associated with sexual aggression, and the study further found that evidence was particularly weak in longitudinal studies, suggesting an absence of long-term effects, and that violent pornography was weakly correlated with sexual aggression, and that the current evidence was unable to distinguish between selection effects as compared to socialization effects. And they added that studies that employed more best practices tended to provide less evidence for relationships, whereas studies with citation bias, an indication of researcher expectancy effects, tended to have higher effect sizes. Population studies suggest that increased availability of pornography is associated with reduced sexual aggression at the population level. And again, if you want to see that excerpt that we just described of the interview that Dr. Dobson conducted with Bundy to judge for yourself, it's in the article linked in the description for our paid subscribers.
Bundy claimed he had a good life as a child. However, a 2020 study published in the journal Psychiatry, Psychology, and Law found that, quote, sexual, physical, and psychological abuse often led to distinct crime scene behaviors, and that their research, quote, highlights the importance of childhood abuse as a risk factor for serial killers' behaviors. I thought that was so weird hearing Ted Bundy be like, I had a great childhood, and like Dahmer saying the same thing, and then it is clearly just, it's like, are they in denial about it?
Well,
it's weird.
Other studies have found that animal abusers were up to 5 times more likely to commit acts of violence, and serial killers often kill or torture animals as children as a control-seeking behavior, the result of feeling powerless against their parents. So they take that out on animals. And a 2009 study in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence found that individuals who witness animal abuse are 8 times more likely to become perpetrators of violence. And the study also found significant overlap between populations exposed to animal abuse, child abuse, and domestic violence. And for our subscribers, for our paid subscribers, if you are looking at the article, you will see a Venn diagram that shows this overlap between animal abuse, child abuse, and domestic violence. And it is very significant.
It is, it is a trope of serial murder that serial killers start by killing animals. Behavior associated with exerting dominance and power. Bundy himself is known to have abused and killed animals as a child, including mice. He bought mice especially for this purpose, which is so sick, as well as pets belonging to his neighbors.
Lee Malvo, the DC sniper, was reported to have targeted cats with a slingshot. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were both reported to have boasted about mutilating cats for fun. Anders Breivik, who killed 8 people and injured 209 others on July 22, 2011 in Norway, would torture rats and put bumblebees in water so that he could watch them drown. Devin Patrick Kelly, the perpetrator in the First Baptist Church shooting in Sutherland, Texas, bragged, quote, about snapping his pet dog's neck when he was just 10 years old. And he pled guilty to animal cruelty for punching a dog as an adult. He told a coworker he was buying dogs on Craigslist to shoot for target practice. Brenda Spencer, who opened fire at Grover Cleveland Elementary School in San Diego, California in 1979, she was known to hunt birds around her neighborhood and was also reported to have repeatedly abused cats and dogs, for instance, by setting their tails on fire. Salvador Ramos, the Uvalde school shooter, boasted about torturing animals, and he even broadcast acts of animal abuse on the French live streaming platform Yubo. Nicholas Cruz, the perpetrator in the Parkland school shooting, began shooting squirrels and chickens when he was in elementary school. And as a teenager, he killed frogs. He tried to maim baby potbelly pigs and crush animals trapped in rabbit holes. And on Instagram, Cruz even boasted about killing animals, and he posted images of dead ones. So this is very common among people who commit multiple murders.
There's also Luca Magnotta, that documentary called Don't Fuck with Cats.
Yeah, there's just an endless amount of examples of this.
There really are. I wanted to bring that up because it is literally the title of the documentary. I want to say real quick, I love dogs so much. Our sweet Akita is taking a nap right here next to us, and it makes me so mad because I'm like, how stupid are you? Dogs literally will do anything for you. They will be your best friend. Why would you hurt a dog?
I read a really interesting statistic earlier today that asked people who they felt closest to in their families, and 97% reported feeling closest to their dog, compared to 87% who felt closest to their mother, and 73% who felt closest to their father.
Not surprised.
I'm not either, but the disparity in those is just a lot. So I thought I'd mention it since you brought that up.
That's sweet. I love dogs.
So there was a 1998 paper entitled Multiple Homicide, Patterns of Serial and Mass Murder by James Allen Fox and Jack Levin, which was originally published in the journal Crime and Justice, which suggested that the distinctions that are commonly made between serial murder and mass murder have been overemphasized at what they call the expense of understanding. And they present a unified typology for multiple murder based on motivation rather than timing.
The authors note that a number of serial murder cases better fit some mass killer types, and certain mass killers reflect motives common to serial offenders. For example, Richard Speck, who in 1966 raped and murdered 8 Chicago nursing students in their dormitory, may have had robbery as a secondary motive, but his primary objective was, by his own admission, thrill-seeking or hell-raising. Likewise, the infamous Unabomber was technically a serial killer, yet he resembled the set-and-run mass killer type.
And I've included convenient links for our paid subscribers. They can go read. Last year, we published an article on Richard Speck and an article on Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. And there's links to both of them that are mentioned in the quote from the authors of that study. I included links to our stories in case our subscribers want to go read them. I believe the Unabomber article is free, although I'm not 100% on that. But I think the Spec one is an archive, which means that it's paid subscriber only.
Additionally, the authors also write that, quote, by focusing so much on timing, one victim at a time versus several victims at once, criminologists may have artificially dichotomized cases of multiple murder and, therefore, have obscured important similarities between serial and mass killers in terms of their motivation. Particularly as a result of this problem, researchers have employed a third form of multiple...
Squeaky chair.
Very squeaky. Where was I? Stop.
Oh, we're tired.
We are. Okay, so yes, by focusing on one victim versus multiple victims, they're saying that this could have artificially created a larger gap between serial killers versus mass murderers. And that is very interesting.
A larger one than actually exists.
Right, right, in terms of their motivation. So, quote, particularly as a result of this problem, researchers have employed a third form of multiple homicide, spree killing. To handle hybrid cases, they cannot adequately be described as either.
So like Lee Malvo, the DC sniper that we mentioned earlier, he'd be a spree killer, right?
Right.
There's a table that I've included from that study for our paid subscribers, which details motivations for multiple murder that are shared by serial murderers and mass murderers. And they include power, revenge, loyalty, profit, and terror. And the terror one, I just want to point out, and although we're both exhausted, we're going to try to record another one after this, I think, about Columbine. And the Columbine shooters, Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris, according to their journals, if you read their journals, which, by the way, are included in the articles that we've written on Columbine, if you want to go peruse them, we made them easy for you to find. But they talk about being inspired by, I'll give you a second. You can think of who you think they might have been inspired by. I think you're going to be surprised in a moment when I give you the reveal that the Columbine mass shooting was inspired by the Oklahoma City bombing.
I thought that was interesting because everyone's like, Marilyn Manson, you know?
It was explicitly meant to be a terrorist act.
Very interesting.
They wrote about that.
Very interesting. And that is so incredibly overlooked in all of this. And that to me is sad. I think that we have to be accurate and look at what are they actually saying, what are they actually, doing based on their manifestos to really understand this so we can like pinpoint it and avoid it in the future.
There's been so much garbage published about Columbine.
So much.
Those articles are so long, and this was a very long Murder Talk Radio, and the Columbine Murder Talk Radio is also going to be very long because I published 2 very long articles that I spent a long time on putting together.
Yeah, you did an incredible job with those.
Thank you. As part of my mass shooting / history of school shooting series that I put together, which I'm very proud of. It's the only thing like it that exists. Nobody else has ever written such a work. Yeah, it's available for our subscribers. A lot of those articles are free. Not all of them, but a lot of them I made free because I think that it's very important that we understand exactly why those things are happening. I think too often we blame things that don't really have anything to do with the crime that has been committed. In the case of Bundy, pretending to be Christian and blaming pornography and violent media. He doesn't just blame violent pornography, he also blames detective films that he liked when he was a kid, which is ridiculous.
It is. It's absolutely ridiculous.
And the same thing with the school shootings. People blame guns, but in the Trends and Conclusions article of that mass shooting series that I did, even places that have banned guns have mass shootings. They happen anyway. And the people who live in those places will tell you that they don't, but I've documented them in the Trends and Conclusions articles, so you can go see them for yourself. They still exist. They still happen. Banning guns does not prevent mass shootings.
People love to hate on guns, and guns are not the problem.
Yeah, I personally think that every single person on this planet has the right, the natural right, to own the tools of their own self-defense.
Absolutely. It's not going to change the behavior of people like this.
As a side note, at least in the West, the right to own the tools of your own self-defense dates back to before the time of the Magna Carta. It was enshrined in law before guns even existed, the right to own swords, because would-be dictators back before guns would try to control who could and couldn't own a goddamn sword. ridiculous.
Yep.
All right, that wraps it up for this episode of Murder Talk Radio. Thank you for listening.
I'm Victoria Evans.
I'm Parker Evans, and we will figuratively see you next time.